How many of you have been to Yellowstone? Or on your way to Yellowstone? How many of you have been to Jellystone? Well, there you go. I give a lot of presentations, and I have to say this is one of my favorites. I really enjoy doing this one. I started here a little over 3 years ago, actually 4 years ago. Had been on the job all of 3 weeks when our PR director, who was in charge of these things, came up to me and he said, "By the way, did you know that your predecessor had committed to doing this presentation out at Yellowstone in 2 weeks?" And I said, "No, I didn't." And he said, "Well, do you want to do it?" And I said, "Yeah, the deal is we get a free two-night stay at the Lake Lodge, so what's not to like?" And he said, "Well, what do you want to speak on?" And I asked, "Well, what was she planning to do?" And he said, "Oh, she was going to do something on the history of the national parks." And I thought, yeah, that sounds kind of boring. So he said, and I told him that, so he said, "Well, what else would you like to do?" And I said, "I don't know, how about Yellowstone and Jellystone?" Totally off the top of my head. Well, as it turned out, 2008 was the 50th anniversary of Yogi Bear. I didn't realize that at the time, but this presentation flowed out of that. And because we are so closely tied to Yellowstone here, because there is such interest in bears, because they're in the news a lot, most recently with a tragedy where a hiker was killed at Yellowstone by attacked by a grizzly bear. You know, there's a lot of fascination, good and bad, with that. I think this speaks to that, and also just says a little bit about who we are and how we value the world around us. So without further ado, Yellowstone and Jellystone. Anybody recognize that document? That is the enabling legislation from 1872 that created Yellowstone National Park, which you may know. If you don't, it was not only the first national park in the United States, it was the first national park in the world. So we really did have a milestone there with the creation of this magnificent park 50 miles to the west of us. Legislation was kind of interesting. It kind of laid out the boundaries for Yellowstone, but one thing it did not do was specifically prohibit the killing of animals in the park. It had some language in there about how this would preserve wildlife and so forth, but there was nothing that specifically excluded hunting. There were, as there are now, bears at Yellowstone, although back then there were many more bears. And as people came to Yellowstone to, among other things, to hunt, certainly bears were one of the targets. One of the things the enabling legislation did do, and what really needed to be done as kind of a necessity, was to set something up to keep the peace at Yellowstone. And so the U.S. cavalry, the Army, was sent in there, and they actually were the park rangers, the park force at Yellowstone, up until 1916, when the National Park Service was created, and you actually had professionally trained park personnel. But for better than 30 years, you had the U.S. cavalry patrolling Yellowstone, and one of their chief jobs was to stop poaching of animals. The enabling legislation that I mentioned was amended in 1883 to explicitly prohibit hunting, but there were still issues with poaching, with people coming in. You know, it's a huge area, it's hard to police the borders. People would come in intentionally or inadvertently and go hunting, and so one of the big jobs for the cavalry was to police the area and try to cut down on illegal poaching of animals. Well, as you might imagine, as word spread of all that Yellowstone had to offer, as it was being promoted as America's wonderland, people started flocking there. Initially in the hundreds, because it was hard to get to, but certainly within a decade by the thousands. And they continued to come, and with each year that passed, more and more people came to Yellowstone, you know, to see things that they literally could not see anywhere else, to see geysers, to see the remains of ancient volcanoes, to see hot springs and so forth, and to see wildlife. The scarf on the left, which is from our collection, has some of the most famous things, Old Faithful, and Mammoth Hot Springs and so forth. And certainly one of the big draws was bears. Because let's face it, where else are you going to see grizzly bears if not in a national park? If you're coming from back east, the chances of you running into a bear are pretty slim. So animals were and remain a big draw at Yellowstone. Now, bears, as you may know, are fairly intelligent and adaptable creatures. They very quickly made the connection that where our people are, there's what? Food, absolutely. And so almost off the bat, as tourists start flocking to Yellowstone, you begin to have encounters, interactions between bears and people, largely revolving around feeding. And just as I said that bears are intelligent, we humans demonstrated time and again that we are remarkably unintelligent when it comes to losing all of our fear and hesitation around wild animals. And the photographs I'm going to show you are just a small sampling of photographs that just kind of make you shake your head and wonder, what were they thinking? I mean, look at the people there. They're actually giving donuts to bears off of that wagon. Here is a woman giving a bear a cookie. What could be cuter than the thought that you could give a bear a cookie like that? See it stand up on its hind legs with those great big soft eyes, looking at you, begging for something. Well, this became a real problem, and the park realized it. As the park superintendent said, the bears of the park, this is in 1902, the bears of the park, while absolutely wild, are perfectly harmless. Excuse me, get that off of there. Are perfectly harmless, but when rendered tame by being fed in any other way except at the regular garbage pits at the various hotels, the bears lose all their fear of human beings and will enter kitchens and camps in search of food, thereby frequently doing considerable damage to property and possessions. And a few years later, another superintendent said, the bears are no longer wild animals. They have become personified. They are like people, and the visitors to the park seem to treat them as such. It's becoming a real problem here because, the bears, after all, to them it's all food, and they're going to go where people are to look for food, whether it's in a campground or whether it's on a hiking trail or if it's outside the hotel, wherever. They became kind of imbued with this notion that where there were people, there's got to be food, and so they came around looking for it. And there were reports of injuries, and in 1910, tragically, the first reported fatality at Yellowstone from a bear attack where a hotel employee who was taking out the trash was attacked and mauled by a bear. This is becoming an issue for the park. What are you going to do about it? People are coming here to see bears. We don't want to prevent them from seeing bears, but we also realize we've got a real problem here. Well, the solution they came up with was to create what they called bear kitchens, or bear cafeterias, or bear pits. There's a bear feeding station, and you see the sign on it, lunch counters for bears. These were set up in the vicinity of hotels, and they were laid out with this big wooden platform, and the park had employees whose job it was to maintain the bear feeding stations. At designated times of the day, they would go out and they would dump food into these big garbage pits, and the bears would come around and start feeding. There's a ranger, or I'm not sure, frankly, I'm not sure if that's a ranger or a cavalry officer on a horse, but looking at the bears, and you see there's close to a dozen bears there in this bear cafeteria. And these became all the rage. In fact, they were promoted as part of the tourist attraction at Yellowstone, and in some places, like near Old Faithful and near Mammoth, the park actually set up bleachers that could seat up to 3,000 people because the nightly bear feedings were billed as something that you did not want to miss. And so you'd come in, and this would be timed so whenever it was dark, it might be 9 or 10 o'clock at night, so you'd go up into the grandstands and sit there and wait, and you know, it would be very dark, and you kind of hear this commotion down in front of you. And then all of a sudden the lights would be turned on, and you would see the bears there in the pit, growling and growling and fighting one another to get at the food. And you'd watch them feed, and then the show would be over for the night, and you'd come back the next night. So bear feeding at Yellowstone became just a staple of going to visit Yellowstone, and actually also at other parks like Yosemite after they were created. So you had bear keepers, you had bear feeders, bear cafeterias. So again, the sense that, well, bears are really just like people. You know, look at how cute they are. They do things like they stand up on platforms, or they come around and they beg at picnic tables, and you know, sometimes they'll stand up on their hind legs and look at you, and gosh, aren't they cute. The lower photograph there, down in the lower right, anybody know what that is showing? Any guess? The man in the white Panama hat in the center of the picture in the dark suit is none other than President Calvin Coolidge, visiting Yellowstone in 1924 and being entertained by tame bears that are right there. Now, can you imagine the Secret Service allowing that to happen today? To let the bears just kind of be there? I just don't think so. Well, speaking of presidents, something else is going on. I'm going to kind of put this in the context of other things that are happening in American popular culture to kind of set the stage for what happens. Theodore Roosevelt, who was president for most of the time between 1901 and 1909, very popular. You know, he took over after McKinley was assassinated. People loved him. He was an outdoorsman, an avid outdoorsman and a hunter. And people respected and admired him for that. In 1903, President Roosevelt, took a hunting trip that was widely publicized. He went to Louisiana, along with members of his cabinet and famous hunting people and so forth. He spent about 2 weeks out in the wilderness, and they were there primarily to hunt bears. Wasn't going very well. They weren't having a very good time of it. And one day, some of the people in Roosevelt's party captured a bear cub, tied it to a tree, and said, "Mr. President, go ahead and shoot it. At least one of us can say that we have had a successful bear hunt. Go ahead and bag that cub." And Roosevelt said, "I'm not going to shoot an innocent bear cub." And he demanded that they told everybody to let it go. And as you see in this editorial cartoon, turned his back on the whole situation. Saved the day. Teddy saved the day, and this was all over the newspapers. Front page stories in every national newspaper. And because of that, to honor Teddy Roosevelt and his bravery and his valor in saving that poor, helpless bear, somebody got the great idea to sell stuffed teddy bears. And that was when the teddy bear craze started. And factories that were producing teddy bears literally could not keep up with the demand. Everybody wanted to have a teddy bear. It was the fashionable thing to do, to be going out dressed to the nines with your tuxedo or your fancy ball gown and to have a teddy bear with you. All the rage. And you know, the department stores, Macy's and Gimbel's and so forth, would have these special teddy bear picnics or teddy bear Christmas and so forth. And so millions of people began buying these cuddly, cute bears. I mean, who could resist? This is part of a larger phenomenon that's taking place in American popular culture during this time. That big word there, anthropomorphic, means ascribing to animals the qualities of people. And there are a couple of examples there. Who's that on the left? Winnie the Pooh. A. Milne, after reading about teddy bears, got the idea to create a children's book. Actually, it started out as a series of poems about Christopher Robin and his teddy bear, but it grew into the Winnie the Pooh stories that we all know and love, with this cute bear who walked and talked, was just adorable, and who seemed mainly interested in getting honey. And on the right, of course, is Bambi, just one example of many Disney characters that were created during this time. And not just Disney, but Warner Brothers and other studios started producing these kind of animal characters that in some cases they walked and talked and acted like people, and even if they didn't talk, they still reflected human emotions. And the stories were very human. And so this sense of blurring the lines between animals and people was just going on, was very much in vogue during this period. So again, bringing this back to Yellowstone, I mean, look at that. Aren't they cute? You know, by this time cars are in Yellowstone and tour buses, and this idea that bears will walk right up to your car, and you know, they're just adorable. This is a cartoon by Olive Fell, a local artist who lived here in Cody for a number of years, but she was hired by the Burlington and Northern Railroad, which brought people to Toluca and to Cody by railroad so that they could get on cars or buses and head to Yellowstone. It was as close as you could get by rail. But the railroad hired her to promote tourism to Yellowstone, and she started doing it with bears, drawing these caricatures of bears doing fun things. You know, like this one. Here they are in their cars enjoying the West. And again, they're just like people. They're adorable. How could you resist? But here's another illustration from our Whitney Gallery, just like that one. Everybody knows that bears, they may have their cute side, but let's not forget that they are, after all, not so warm and fuzzy. They're wild animals, and they're prone to doing what wild animals do, which is to attack, particularly if they feel they're threatened or if they're not getting their way, they will attack. And again, the reports of injuries and occasional fatalities were on the increase. The more people that came to Yellowstone, the more people that were involved in trying to feed bears, the more the numbers go up year after year. You know, you're getting upwards of 1 million people at Yellowstone, and every year there's anywhere from 100 to 300 reports of people being attacked by bears, and lots of near misses. Sorry, I don't know why that keeps coming up.
It does remind me in 10 minutes.
Yeah,
So
next time it comes up, I will kill it. Here again, just examples of how they were not warm and fuzzy. They would go through campgrounds. They would tear things up, attack people's tents. A reporter who visited Yellowstone in the 1950s had this to say: "The bears are brazen. They have no fear of man, and they will come right into a tent if they smell food. They have regular routes through a campground, going from one dumpster to another, opening them with a paw, rooting around, then letting the lids bang shut. All night long it's bang, bang, bang as the bears make their rounds. We got little sleep at that campsite. The bears even visited camp in broad daylight. One afternoon a bear came ambling into the campground. People started banging pots and pans together, but the bear came on. Finally, one man started throwing big rocks at the bear. One hit it, and the bear took off like a racehorse." You know, really scary encounters between people and bears. And it's a real dilemma for the Park Service. On the one hand, they want to promote tourism to Yellowstone. They want to give the sense that it's safe. They're publicly promoting and operating these bear counters where people can come and watch the feeding. At the same time, they want to preach that it's unsafe. Don't get close to bears. There were fines for feeding bears. You could be penalized, money, or you could be fined money or asked to leave the park. But the reality was that the park really wasn't enforcing the penalties that they had. They were just kind of looking the other way. It's risky business. I mean, this is a photograph here from about 1955. And this man is on the highway looking at a bear, photographing a bear that is looking into the window of a car. If that bear turned and saw him and ran towards him, the guy would have no escape. Hold on. This, you know, as I said, it's a difficult situation for the park. They're really struggling with this. On the one hand, they want to be nice guys. At the same time, they want to crack down. Real mixed messages. For example, the park's chief naturalist was quoted as saying in an interview in 1956, "This may be heresy, but I hope the time never comes when there are no bears sitting by the roadside awaiting a handout or in the campgrounds taking advantage of the careless camper. This is a tradition of Yellowstone, and some 1 million annual visitors love it." So here you've got the park's chief naturalist essentially saying, what's the big deal? People come here expecting to feed the bears. Let them feed the bears. So, which brings us all to that wonderful time we all know, and some of us remember better than others, those of us who are a little older than me and were alive. I was actually born in 56, so I barely remember it, but the 50s, what a golden time it was. You know, this is the classic image here of Mom and Dad and Junior sitting around a TV set, Dad with his pipe and slippers, and just a happy family scene. Just truly a golden age. I mean, it was the time of TV dinners. It was the time of Norman Rockwell paintings of picnics and happy times. Just a golden time that we look back on fondly with a lot of nostalgia. It was also a time when the baby boom was exploding. I'm a product of that. Other baby boomers were a product of that. People had come off of World War II. They now had lots of disposable income. They had lots of leisure time on their hands to do whatever, including making babies. So you've got lots of young people being born. It's also the golden age of comedy on television. Television had really started to come into vogue in the late 1940s, and by the early 1950s, better than half the households in America had a television set. I mean, it was remarkable how quickly it spread. And you got to do something to fill the airwaves, and comedy was a mainstay. Do you recognize some of the shows there? What do you see there? Milton Berle. Others there? Dinah Shore. Lots of Jack Webb there with Dragnet. Lots of news programs, lots of drama, but especially lots of comedy. Lots of half-hour, what were called situation comedies built around the adventures of a family. Let's zoom back to Yellowstone National Park in the 1950s. By the early 1950s, 1 million people a year. By the late 1950s, 1960, 2 million people a year. It doubled in that time. Lots of people, again, with disposable income, with time on their hands, with young families, are coming to Yellowstone in larger numbers than they've ever come before. And as always, they're seeing bears, like this photograph that shows bears that we saw. There's a bear with a trash can on its head. Gosh, isn't that cute? And there's bears along the roadway. And what became known as moocher bears, bears standing on their hind legs and begging for food, begging people to give them a handout. There's 3 examples of moocher bears. And, you know, again, how cute is that? And look at this. I mean, isn't that great? It looks like right out of Goldilocks and the 3 bears. There's Mama Bear, Papa Bear, and Baby Bear looking in the window, asking for a handout. You would think that this is a good thing. This actually was the photograph that was used on the Park Service's brochure to warn people against feeding the bears. You know, it said very clearly, bears are dangerous, do not feed the bears. And yet it has this huge photograph on it of, it's like an invitation to a photo op. Get your camera ready because right around that next bend there are going to be bears at your car looking in your windows, and boy, they're cute. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a huge leap of the imagination to go from an anonymous hungry bear looking in a car window to this poor hungry bear with big eyes, Yogi Bear. So the brainchild of 2 brilliant animators, Joe Hanna and William Barbera, who had worked for Screen Gems in the early 1950s and mid-1950s. They were making cartoons. Who's that on the right? Tom and Jerry. Their big hit. Well, Warner Brothers and Screen Gems decided they were going to get out of the animation business. And so Hanna-Barbera formed their own company in 1956. And they got this brilliant idea that this is the age of situation comedies on television. Let's create a half-hour cartoon show for primetime television, and let's make it all about animals. And so Rough and Ready, this story about a dog and a cat, becomes the first primetime cartoon. It was such a huge success that it was followed a year later by the Huckleberry Hound show, about the adventures of this lovable, slow-talking Southern sheriff. Cartoons, if nothing, were not imitative because it was almost a plagiarism of the Andy Griffith show. But it had 3 sections to it. It had the Huckleberry Hound cartoons. It had come on in, folks, if you want to join this. It had Pixie and Dixie, which was kind of a recycled version of Tom and Jerry, but with a couple of more mice. And in the middle segment, it had this cartoon about this bear named Yogi Bear, a lovable bear who lived in this wonderful mythical place called Jellystone National Park. And it was a big hit. This was the original music for that. Who is always on the spot? Who is Yogi Bear? Who keeps cool when things are hot? Who does Yogi Bear? Who believes that while they dream and falls for some fantastic scheme but always winds up on the beam? Yogi Bear. That was the very first Yogi Bear song. And if I can get this to work, here was what followed it when Yogi got his own show, the first TV spin-off that came out 50 years ago in 1961.
Yogi Bear is smarter than the average bear. Yogi Bear is always in the ranger's hair. At a picnic table you will find him there, stopping down more goodies than the average bear. He will sleep till noon, but before it's dark, he'll have every picnic basket that's in Jellystone Park. Yogi has it better than a millionaire. That's because he's smarter than the average bear.
Yogi is this lovable bear who walks and talks and chases picnic baskets in Jellystone Park. As I said, animators were nothing if not imitative. Imitation is the purest form of flattery. Let me get that out of there. Who's that on the right? Art Carney. Playing what character? Remember? Ralph Crammer, whose name is totally escaping me right now, but he was on The Honeymooners. He played the sidekick to Jackie Gleason's character on The Honeymooners, and the same slouch, the same hat, the same kind of expression. I mean, he was modeled right after, Yogi Bear's character was modeled right after his character. Who's that on the left? Who is Yogi Bear for the uninformed? Great catcher for the New York Yankees. And why was Yogi Bear famous? In addition to what he did as a catcher.
His catchphrases.
Like what? Anybody? It ain't over till it's over. You've heard that. I mean, these become part of our vocabulary. They're just so ingrained in us. My favorite Yogi Bear story, which says something about his humor, which is kind of unthinking humor, just the way he said things, was he went into a pizza restaurant and ordered a pizza, and the waiter came over and said, "Mr. Barra, would you like your pizza cut into 6 slices or 8 slices?" And he thought for a moment and he said, "You better make it 6. I don't think I can eat 8. I mean, that's the kind of guy he was. But again, the character of Yogi Bear was modeled after that character from the Honeymooners and lovable Yogi Berra because of the things he said. Yogi had his catchphrases just like Yogi Berra did. Hey, 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 chief among them. He was voiced by Don Messick, who gave his name to so many different characters in cartoons. And he had a couple of colleagues who were there. Who's that on the left? Anybody know? Boo Boo. Who's that on the right? Ranger Smith. You know, the whole dynamics of this show was Boo Boo who was kind of like the good angel on Yogi's right shoulder, saying to him, "Gee, I don't know, Yogi," when Yogi would come up with some scheme for getting a picnic basket, and "I'm not so sure that's a good idea." And Ranger Smith, this poor harried ranger who is always trying to pick up after Yogi and the messes that he's made. So the stories, I mean, they all kind of follow the same formula, where Yogi is after some scheme to get a picnic basket. A quick example is a story where Yogi is in a hospital, or I'm sorry, Yogi becomes ill. He says, "Oh, I'm dying, I'm dying." And Ranger Smith is just beside himself, and they have a veterinarian come, and the veterinarian looks at Yogi and says, "Yogi, your problem is you're eating too much people food. We're going to put you on a strict diet of nuts and berries." And so they send him off to a hospital, and Yogi's there in the hospital saying, "Oh, I can't go on, I can't continue, I just can't continue." Ranger Smith is thinking, "I can't have Yogi die on my hands." So he gets the idea the only way he's going to save his friend is to bring him some picnic baskets. So he goes and he rounds up every picnic basket he can find, takes him to Yogi's hospital room. Yogi takes one look at him, grabs him up, jumps out the window, and Ranger Smith realizes he's been had. You know, time and again, and that was the story, and Yogi almost always got his picnic basket. And it was set in Jellystone National Park. Again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to make the connection between Jellystone and Yellowstone. It was modeled right after it. But it wasn't exactly the same. You know, Yellowstone has climate. It has blizzards. If you read the papers, this past winter was one of the worst on record. We had snowdrifts, not snowdrifts, but actual snow in Yellowstone. It was 40 feet deep in some places. I mean, the roads were closed until June in some parts of the park. We have earthquakes. We had a bad earthquake back in 1959. We have forest fires, wildfires. We've got wild animals. Nothing like that in Jellystone. You know, this is what's called a cell, C-E-L, a frame from a cartoon, and it's very carefully composed, and it's kind of a reflection of how Jellystone National Park itself was very neatly composed. Nothing ever went wrong there. There were no floods, no fires, no earthquakes, no volcanoes. It was just happy days. And there were almost no animals there. The only animals you ever saw were these two bears, Boo Boo and Yogi. And they act like people. They walk, they talk, they go around on their hind legs, they drive cars. Yogi sometimes has a parachute. The only other people you would see besides Ranger Smith were portrayed as like idiots. Like this little hunter down there who clearly is almost like Mr. Magoo, doesn't know where he's going, and Yogi's looking at him kind of smiling. And then you've got this huge park with only one ranger in it, Ranger Smith, whose entire job seems to be not doing campfire talks or maintaining trails, but picking up after Yogi. And you know, Yogi will come and stand in his front room and talk to him as if he's just another person. And if you took Yogi's hat and put it on Ranger Smith and took Ranger Smith's hat and put it on Yogi, you might not know the difference between the two of them. Just a total collapse of any line of distinction between people and bears. Well, Yogi was an enormous hit. The show went to the top of the charts. Yogi got his own movie, Hey There, It's Yogi Bear. He got his own newspaper strip, newspaper cartoon. I mean, it was like gravy. And again, for Yellowstone, park officials are really struggling with this issue. On the one hand, there's no question that Yogi is bringing more and more people than ever to Yellowstone. Proof of this would come from the Park Service employees getting asked, "Where's Boo Boo? Where's Yogi?" As if they really existed. There's a story that the Park Service, to try to boost visitation from Europe, actually chartered a bus that would go to major European cities like Berlin and Paris. And the bus would pull up and these Park Service employees would get up and people would start gathering around and kids would start asking, "Where's Boo Boo? Where's Yogi?" You know, so even though these are totally fictional, people began to think, hey, maybe this is based on reality. So the Park Service starts playing on this. This is an article in a magazine, Yogi Bear in Yellowstone, where Yogi is with the park superintendent, and they're actually going around and they're looking at the sights and they're fishing and so forth. So, you know, what's not to like? And this is a sign that was erected outside of, or just inside the entrance to the park at all of the gates, when the Park Service decided, hey, if you can't beat them, join them. Why not use Yogi to tell people, don't feed the bears? So you've got these life-size cutouts that are put in the entrances to say, hey kids, make sure your parents know, don't feed the bears. You know, what could be better than have your chief spokesman be Yogi Bear? Well, that's a real problem when in the cartoons you've got things like Yogi defacing signs, do not feed the bears except Yogi. So it kind of undercuts your message about don't feed the bears if your chief spokesman is seen as making it okay. So Park Service struggled with this for a number of years, and in a tragedy that happened not at Yellowstone but at Glacier National Park in 1969, the matter was resolved because two campers, two young women, both 19 as it turned out, camping in different parts of Glacier, were horribly mauled as they slept in their camp in their sleeping bags one night. Became known as Night of the Grizzlies. And it was, again, just a total news splash all across the front pages of newspapers. What a tragedy. The Congress started doing investigations, demanding to know what's going on at our national parks. Why are people being killed by bears? What's happening here? Well, you know, maybe part of the reason was that people had become so inured to thinking of bears as cute and cuddly because of Yogi that they lost all fear of bears. What happened as an upshot of this was that the Park Service, prompted by Congress withholding huge amounts of money, decided, hey, we got to shape up our act. And they adopted a new bear management program at Yellowstone and other parks, which was totally unlike what had gone before. Automatic fines. You could be imprisoned for feeding bears. At the very least, you were going to pay a hefty fine. Tough signs. No more bear feeding stations. Those were all closed down. And the park began tagging bears and monitoring their movements, really to get a better understanding of the dynamics of grizzly bear and black bear populations. But a total sea change from what had gone before. As the Park Service said, the era of Yogi is over at the national parks. And so it was. So what happens to Yogi? Where does he go? Well, he leaves Jellystone National Park for Jellystone Park. About the same time as the Park Service began implementing this really tough anti-bear feeding program, a group of investors in Wisconsin got the brilliant idea to license from Hanna-Barbera some of the names Yogi and Boo Boo Bear and Ranger Smith and Jellystone, and they created a company called Jellystone Resorts to set up a chain of campgrounds around the country. These Jellystone camp resorts. And there's photographs, all of them, and they're still in existence today. There were at one time as many as 200 of these. There's now about 75, but they're still around. Had larger-than-life inflatable yogis. They had all the characters there. You know, you could take your family to Jellystone. Here's brochures for one outside of New Orleans, one in Colorado, one in Wisconsin Dells. They were all over the United States and also in Canada. Well, just like Yogi is not your average bear, Jellystone parks were not your average park. They were quite the opposite from a national park. Here is a list of amenities for Jellystone Park with all sorts of things. I mean, it goes on for both sides of the brochure. There you see 3 columns of amenities. And here some of them are: laundromats, miniature golf, indoor pools, bumper carts, video arcades, playgrounds, billiards, go-karts, Elvis impersonators. The list goes on and on. And of course, Yogi. Yogi and his friends were there all the time, and you could go with Yogi on a hay ride every night. They had large convenience stores. They had fast food establishments. So, you know, it's like all the comforts of home in a recreational setting. And if you really wanted to get close to nature, you could even go and watch Old Faithful Geyser erupt every 60 minutes, every hour on the hour, throwing up water for you to enjoy and splash in. So, in contrast to Yellowstone, which was this very chaotic, very naturalistic environment, Jellystone camp resorts are much more like suburbia. They're parks, they're resorts. They're very well kept. They've got tidy lawns, they're manicured. Some of the parks, the Jellystone camp resorts, began selling building lots, and people started putting little condos on their building lots and start tearing up the actual grass and putting down things like AstroTurf and putting in plastic lawn flamingos and yard balls. So, you know, it's becoming like an extension of your own backyard. So, Yogi had come a long way from Jellystone National Park, but he seemed right at home. Here's a quote. This is from a blogger from 2003. "I had a blast over the weekend at Jellystone Park. We stayed in a full amenities villa, and the kitchen even had a dishwasher. No more just camping for me. We took a golf cart tour of the place, and we saw a Yogi. He was riding the opposite way. He actually waved at us." So you kind of enter this very well manicured, fanciful world, and what's not to like? And the promoters of Jellystone capitalized on everything that their parks had to offer, and everything that, by contrast, you would give up by going to a national park. Here's a quote from one of their company spokesmen. "A national park is great for getting away from it all, pitching your tent, opening your six-pack, but if you have children 2 to 6, you're there an hour and it's like, Mom, what are we going to do now? I'm bored." So, you know, if you really want to have a family vacation that's fun-filled and memorable, don't go near a national park, because you're going to be there and you're going to get bored. Go to Jellystone, where you can have everything you want. What was billed as the ultimate Jellystone camp resort opened in 1973 in Oakland, California. Along with all the other amenities it had, it also included a discotheque, a nightclub with full liquor service, and a wine and cheese shop. It had Boo Boo's Goodie Shop, it had 2 swimming pools, it had gas grills, and it was located in a suburban area across the parking lot from a strip shopping center. And if you got tired of being in the Jellystone camp, you could go half a block away to a shopping mall. You know, you weren't giving up anything. Well, again, life imitating art. In 1991, Yogi came back to television in a new TV series called Yo Yogi. He's no longer at Jellystone Park. Now he lives at Jellystone Mall. And he and Boo Boo and their friends are dressed in khakis and Nikes and sunglasses, and their job is essentially to help not park officer, but mall officer Smith maintain order at Jellystone Mall. They do things like find lost wallets, returning lost kids to their parents, policing the mall to make sure that there aren't bullies. You know, it was just the total antithesis of everything that represented anything natural. And the Park Service was asked about this, and a spokesman said, "We worry about the message it sends to TV viewers when the smarter than your average bear leaves a park for a mall." But there he was. Well, the public is probably smarter than we give them credit for. Yo Yogi lasted less than half a season before it disappeared. But what's happened, and again, I think this is because of the influence of Yogi, is you see this trend for national parks to become more and more like resorts. Public demand, I think, instilled in part by things like Jellystone camp resorts, is pushing to have full-service eateries and fast food restaurants and ice cream shops in national parks to have golf courses nearby, to have other amenities, to have cell phone towers, to have satellite TV, and it's not too long before you can envision maybe a shopping mall being, if not in a national park, certainly right next door to it. Well, as I said, when I first did this presentation back in 2008, it was Yogi's 50th birthday, and you can see on a box of cornflakes how that was celebrated. And Yogi is still with us. Even last year, a movie came out with the voices of Dan Aykroyd and Justin Timberlake and Rick Moranis, all about Yogi and his adventures in Jellystone. So he's still with us. And we're grateful for that, because after all, Yogi did give us an awful lot. But what have we lost in the process? Here's what a Jellystone representative had to say, the story he told. I've had people come up to me in the morning and say, there were bears in my garbage can last night. And I'm not kidding, I saw a bear out there. And I'll ask them, was his name Yogi? No, those weren't bears you saw, those were raccoons. So, I mean, that's kind of like the ultimate irony, that people no longer even recognize bears when they see them. They can't identify a raccoon as being a raccoon. A few years ago, this wonderful book was published by a man named Richard Louv called Last Child in the Woods. It's all about how we have so carefully insulated our children from contact with nature, which is, after all, wild and untamed, and we want them to live in this kind of bubble, this kind of enclosed environment. The message to kids and parents is very clear. Nature's in the past. It doesn't count anymore. The future's in electronics. The boogeyman lives in the woods. For tens of thousands of years, children spent much of their childhood playing or working in natural settings. Yet now that's all in danger of disappearing. This is a radical change. It's got profound implications for who we are. Nobody, least of all me, as a parent, wants my children to be the last child in the woods. You know, I think the message, the ultimate takeaway is it's fun to laugh at Yogi and his adventures. It's fun to laugh at Jellystone, but let's not do it at the expense of visiting the real wonders that can be found in our backyards and in our doorstep by visiting national parks like Yellowstone. Thank you.